Good morning, YouTube. Baubles on a lot here. Easter Sunday, Ostara Sunday, 27th of March, and we're going to have a little picture show. In a conversation on the thread, I mentioned how big lobsters used to be back in the day. 1962, my uncle's boat. 1962, a blackfish, 1 foot long. 1962, same blackfish, lying between the antenna of a lobster, which is lying on a 7-foot long door. The uncle in question was a pioneer spearfisher back in the days of latex dry suits and scuba tanks. He was the first person to spearfish Southwest Solitary Island. Look carefully, you can see the spear hole in the fish. And that's how big lobsters were back in the day, when there was an environmental surplus to be harvested. So, there you go. Now you know. Not everything is bigger in Texas.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy, and you're not.
Joining me today, Dr. Zare Ghazarian, lecturer in politics at the School of Social Sciences at Monash University. He's the author of Politics for Dummies, a book whose time is now. Bernard Keane is politics editor for Crikey, and Parnell Palm McGuinness is a communications consultant and writer. Thanks all. What a week. To the delight of the political class. It's on. Or maybe.
Today, I called upon His Excellency the Governor-General to advise him to recall both Houses of Parliament on April 18 to consider and pass the Australian Building and Construction Commission bills and the Registered Organisation Bill. If the Senate fails to pass these laws, I will advise the Governor-General to dissolve both Houses of Parliament and issue writs for an election.
Bernard Keane, that sounds very important.
It does sound very important. It's meant to sound important. It's meant to sound decisive. It's meant to sound as though Malcolm Turnbull's got a plan, it's mainly this is prime political theatre. It's political theatre directed at the Senate, but most particularly it's directed at his backbench, which is becoming increasingly fractious.
What about us?
But most of all, it's directed at voters to give the impression that what has been a desperate government, a desperate directionless government, actually does have a plan and has a sense of direction and has a sense of purpose, which it has completely lacked so far under Malcolm Turnbull. I mean, so far this year in 2016, Turnbull's made every post a loser in terms of convincing voters that he's got a plan. So the plan is now to get this noxious ABCC bill through Parliament, and if it doesn't go through, let's go to the poll.
So in that context, Bernard, of making every post a loser, is this seizing the moment, or is it just panic? Is it just desperation?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, there is an opportunity here, but I think if things were going better for Malcolm Turnbull, then he wouldn't be being forced into this position. If the polls hadn't, if his polling lead hadn't collapsed, if he wasn't under constant criticism from all directions about the lack of any policy substance, if Scott Morrison was performing capably as treasurer, then this would, I think, the rush to a double dissolution election, may not be quite so central to the government's narrative. But I mean, look, the government doesn't have a narrative. Now it has a narrative about the ABCC and rushing to an early election. And that's, from the Prime Minister's point of view, he's going to hope that's enough to convince voters that he knows what he's doing.
Parnell, what's your sense of that narrative and about the timing, the vibe of the whole thing?
Well, my sense is that he's pretty much what Bernard's saying, that he feels that it's politically time. But he also seems to be right. The polls are telling us that people want to go to an election right now. The majority of Australians are in favour of going to the election. Also, I take issue with the idea that there's no plan. So Turnbull's not very good at communicating it. Ironic for the great communicator. But at the very beginning, he said that he was planning to run an agile government, an iterative government. Now, if you're going to do that, that means that you're going to have to back away from things along the way, which he's been doing. He's just not been communicating the why and the what very well, and that's been leaving him open to criticism.
That's an interesting thing, Zoe, because we could get to a position after the elevated budget, which may please everybody, where we all wonder what the fuss was about. There appears to be a vacuum which has been filled with all sorts of speculation, but maybe it'll just turn out to be, oh, okay, that sounds sensible, we'll go and vote for you.
Certainly that's something that can play out, and this is really a great circuit breaker. It's a great political move that hits the reset button just for a moment, just makes the last few months where the government and Malcolm Turnbull's popularity has been slowly on the decline. It just makes people refocus on the issues that the Prime Minister wants people to focus on. And presumably that's going to be the economy. The economy is going to be front and centre.
Not the ABCC?
The ABCC is a very useful political tool for the Prime Minister at this point in time, because that's the button that he's hit, that's the reset button there. And he's using that as a very wise and shrewd political move that can ultimately force the Senate's hand, and he and his government can reclaim the political debate.
Do we need to be convinced, Parnell, that the ABCC is an important and much needed measure that needs at any expense to be brought into being?
Not at all. I think that there is only a very small fraction of Australians who really care about the ABCC as a trigger or otherwise. It's also only a very small fraction of Australians who care, who are in favour or rather against the ABCC, you know, the 12% of union representatives in the workforce. So I think that it really is just a trigger, and it's being taken by the electorate as such as well. It's all of the evidence shows that people are in favour of this move.
But here's the thing, Bernard, which could have been brought to the Senate in the last sitting, which it wasn't. Now we have the Parliament reconvened for these weeks at goodness knows what sort of public expense. You know, should we just roll over with that? Are we happy with that sort of manipulation of circumstances?
Well, I mean, that's the cost of politicking. I mean, we're having a plebiscite which will cost $150 million purely because Tony Abbott had a political problem around same-sex marriage. Recalling Parliament having an early election, well, that's just it's all in the prerogative of the Prime Minister. He can call an election whenever he wants. Although, curiously, Malcolm Turnbull has actually managed to tangle himself up in all sorts of knots about this, because there really is only the circumstances in which he finds himself meant that in order to have a double dissolution election after 1 July, because if you had one any earlier, that stuffs up the Senate. You've got to do all these things, including bring the budget forward. So he's managed to turn what is usually a really powerful weapon of incumbency into a bit of a kind of vice that he managed to insert himself in. But look, the ABCC is the MacGuffin of this whole piece of theatre. Voters don't care about trade unions. It doesn't rank high as an issue that they worry about. They think that trade unions and business are pretty much about as corrupt as each other, which is probably a little bit unfair on trade unions, because when business is corrupt, there's usually a lot more zeros on the end of the sums involved. But by and large, we won't be talking about the ABCC very much once the election campaign proper starts. We'll be talking about the economy, and the ABCC has got very little to do with it. In fact, it's got nothing to do with the economy. It's basically an ideological attack on the CFMEU. All the claims that have been made about it in relation to improving productivity within the construction industry are easily disproven lies. But it's the MacGuffin. It gets the plot going, and that plot involves going to the polls on July 2nd. So, you know, in that sense, you know, good on Malcolm Turnbull for using whatever he's got to hand.
And Parnell, that Tony Abbott was quickly out of the blocks after that announcement. The king across the water, saying, you know, that Turnbull will be campaigning on my record. Says Abbott. I mean, Internal politics are very close to the surface in all of this.
They are. They've been for the longest time now, haven't they? It's
Well,
a really sad thing in
It's about
Australia. Sorry,
2009.
that's right, and it's really destructive. It's brought us into this situation where it's like a gaggle of school children having little scraps instead of a bunch of highly paid adults doing a job that they're supposed to be getting on with. I think it's really shameful that people in those situations are having these skirmishes and are not just simply saying, well, in any workplace, there are disagreements and there are sometimes times when things don't go to plan and you've just got to suck it up.
Zare, I mean, this is the interesting thing about an election, I guess, is that at last we get to be dealt into the equation that, as Parnell says, the internal politicking has been going on for so long. This is our moment to shine.
This is it. This is our moment to shine, exactly. And I think when the election proper starts, and we're probably starting to see that now already, what Malcolm Turnbull's announcement has meant is that internal politicking, that the internal sniping, the internal shenanigans of the coalition will take a back seat as backbenchers and those factional leaders start to focus their energy on the real enemy, the Labor and the Greens parties, and put their noses to the wheel and start actually rowing together as a team.
An awkward week for Treasurer Scott Morrison. Here he is on Ray Hadley's show.
We're due to come back on the 10th, I think it is. And
well, it might be the third. It might be the third, Treasurer. Well, you seem to be a little bit hesitant there. You were searching for that date. You were searching for the date, Scott.
May 10th. May 10th.
Sorry, I'm feeling sorry for Scott Morrison here. I mean, the man was clearly dealt out of the process, as we have subsequently discovered.
It's a classic gotcha moment in the media, isn't it, where the guest doesn't really know what's going on around them.
I mean, the PM admitted that the budget timing was determined by a group that excluded the Treasurer. Whose budget will this be on May 3rd?
Well, it won't be Scott Morrison's. I mean, that's pretty clear. I just find it staggering that George Brandis, the Attorney General, and Michaelia Cash, the Employment Minister, and their bureaucrats, as well as the bureaucrats in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, knew about the date of the budget before Scott Morrison and John Fraser, the head of Treasury, did. I just find that absolutely gobsmacking and quite unprecedented.
Especially for a government that prides itself on process. That's what this is.
Well, I thought Malcolm Turnbull was going to. Old Malcolm had gone and been replaced with the new consultative Malcolm, but that doesn't extend to telling the Treasurer when the budget's going to be. Look, Martin Parkinson is the head of Prime Minister and Cabinet. He's the former Secretary of Treasury. People may remember Tony Abbott sacked him. Malcolm Turnbull brought him back. Very good move. Deputy Secretary in Prime Minister and Cabinet is David Gruen, former and really outstanding Treasury officer, who got moved by Tony Abbott to PM&C when Abbott was Prime Minister. I kind of, just reading the tea leaves, I get the impression that was because he was perceived as, engaging in, I can't remember the Orwellian expression for when you're thinking wrongly, but he was guilty of thought crime, I think. So he was moved to PM&C, which means that PM&C actually has a pretty nifty kind of mini treasury in it. And given what we've seen on tax reform and how Scott Morrison's had his legs cut from under him on that, given what's happened on the timing of the budget, and the fact that Martin Parkinson is running the whole tax reform process, I think it's fair to say that this budget will be Malcolm Turnbull's, Martin Parkinson's, and David Gruen's, rather than Scott Morrison and John Fraser.
Should we be relieved about that, Parnell? Is that a good thing?
I think it's nonsense. I don't think that's what's going to happen at all. I think, of course, Turnbull won't be able to resist having his stamp all over this, but no Prime Minister ever has. And Scott Morrison is not the kind of politician who is ideas free and will just let that happen in his absence. He's not an absentee politician. So I think a small matter of tripping over its media feet over a date, which is essentially what happened. Everybody knew that there was a chance it was going to be on May 3. You and I knew that. It was simply that the announcement went out. Well, he knew of the possibility. So everybody in Australia knew of this possibility. And what's happened there is that They've tripped over, sort of Turnbull said something while Morrison's in the middle of a media appearance, and that sort of thing happens. I just don't think it's as big a deal as everybody's
Except that
making
the
it out to
PM
be.
confided, on morning TV as you do, that Morrison hadn't been in the group that made the change, which, as Bernard suggests, you might have expected. Zare, I want to play you two pieces of audio. This is a study in contrasts. First, Malcolm Turnbull.
The advantage of our island geography, our effective border protection and counter-terrorism agencies mean we have confidence that we know who is arriving. Strong borders, vigilant security agencies governed by the rule of law.
Sorry about that. We got to quit. Back with a new movie.